Hello, so this will be another free-falling video. I have decided that I would like to discuss the new trailer, Cracka, that Amazon is putting out, that the mainstream is generally putting out. And what I find interesting about it is that what used to be essentially fringe fanfic or even fringe literary works of the left in general are now really making it into the mainstream. What few people tend to realize is that all leftists are genuinely bad people. They're legitimately evil to some degree, or generally broken people, and they do evil things. And this is why we see this very strange paradigm where they essentially try to classify their opponents as something that is essentially truly fantasy. When you look at who they think they're actually up against, when you look at the nationalists they describe, or the fascists, the Nazis, I don't think even true National Socialists, not even the most decrepit members of the SS, would fit into the extremes they are describing as these almost mythical Goliaths of an opponent. And essentially, what they seem to have is I think they quite literally do live in a fairy tale, where they essentially have described themselves as heroes. They are the heroes, the knights, coming to the aid of these poor oppressed people. And it might also explain why their narrative is always oppressor versus the oppressed, and why essentially they seem to think that the oppressed, need this catalyst oppressor traitor character. Essentially, they feel that they need to stand up as, a member of the oppressors and come down and save the poor oppressed people. It's generally a very despicable idea, but as I don't remember. Sutler's Lament. Yes, he described Vauch as a consequentialist, and I think maybe that I don't think only Vauch is a consequentialist. I think much of the left is consequentialist in their philosophy and their approach to life. When you ask them why is something evil, I think that generally they will look at the results of this action. Hence, why abortion to them isn't at all immoral, is because it is literally just removing a bunch of cells. To them, it's as bad as clipping your fingernails, or taking a bit of skin off after a sunburn. And that might explain it, because generally the action seems very inconsequential. It does seem that way, and it would also explain why veganism is so attractive to them, because the killing of an animal and eating it is extremely consequential, because you're killing an animal. Excuse me, I have allergies, so you'll be probably hearing more of that. But returning to them being generally bad people and their art, and Cracka in specific, we see a lot of what happens in their art in general, and I think art tends to betray the mentality of the artist and in general the spirit of what he is actually recording, because artists aren't just people who put out these weird little quirky things. They generally do tend to get at at some metaphysical concepts, at the very spirit of something. Hence why I enjoy Braveheart. Even though I know it's not a historically accurate film, I think it describes the spirit of what was happening perfectly. And I think it encompasses it in a way that, for example, the Outlaw King could not and cannot. Kingdom of Heaven is another great example. It's not exactly historically accurate. I actually would dare to say that it's quite historically inaccurate, but it still captures a certain spirit around those stories, around what was happening. And I think that's really what art is mostly about. Historical accuracy, of course, it matters, and it ought to be, but at the same time, it's something that can be sacrificed in the name of the authenticity to the spirit of what's going on, which is what art is truly trying to depict. And when we look at leftist art, we look at their narratives, the way they write, the way they make movies. the way they paint pictures, what we can see is that a lot earlier, I think Jared Taylor actually pointed this out, was that there were certain artists who were making very vicious art of black people beheading white people, of black men having white women as essentially concubine slaves. And black women, I think it became extreme at some points. And it's quite an interesting little phenomenon. But what else is interesting is that you can go onto many creative writing forums, and it's quite difficult to find one that is not left-leaning, that doesn't have that LGBT section out there, that doesn't shun generally very traditional right-wing views, and is surprisingly stupidly accepting of everything that is leftist in general. And that, of course, has to do with leftists dominating those circles. But more to the point is that what you end up seeing when you end up seeing when you read these stories that they're publishing, these narratives, when it has to summarize, oftentimes they will quite explicitly, and this isn't even you having to sift through the story to realize this, they will admit it to other people that are studying their writing, that are trying to help them with their writing, that they are trying to make the cis white normal people, the general normal people, the majority, evil in some way, completely incomprehensibly evil. And the story then justifies whatever cruelty is done to these evil normal people. And I find that personally despicable, because it's not a story that's fueled by anything pure. It's not even inspired. Generally, it's just revenge porn, and or really torture porn. And what is Cracka? It's exactly that. It's another story that is produced with an abject hatred towards the normal, towards not being the ones in power. It's something very deep set in leftists, and in general, when you read their works, and when you watch Cracka, you put this together and you realize that it's actually describing their thought process. This is literally what they think. This is how they see the world. And this is what they essentially want. This is, deep down, this is what they want, because art also lets you vent without a filter. It lets you say what you truly want, and oftentimes in these stories, you would even, for example, in LGBT stories, I saw this one story where essentially this person was fantasizing about giving people forced sex transitions and forced sexuality transitions. Oh man, it was insane, but in ways incomprehensibly insane, but still, it was something that was written. And it got some appraisal. Excuse me. And generally, that is my main point, is what I want to say, that if you want to see why leftists are bad people, you don't even need to look to the real world actions. Generally what they'll say is they support Antifa because how can you be a fascist? They just hate the optics of what's happening. They say, oh, it makes you look like bad people, which is what Sittler's Lament points out, with what Vaush points out. But they all agree with it. They all want this to happen. They all think that this is a good thing. And oftentimes when they say, oh, the right, they want to kill all people, oftentimes it's really just projection. It is abject projection. And it is blatantly obvious. And generally, if you call them out on it, they crumble. They don't really have a comeback. They just start cussing you out, and they get really aggressive with you. And that's even without you insulting their intelligence or their demeanor in any way, or calling them out as degenerates. They will. It's all really just one massive fantasy, and to some degree, these people all leftists may be to some degree delusional and or insane. But what is this really predicated upon? Well, it's predicated upon constant propaganda, and this propaganda goes from literally the crib to the schools, to the universities, and then later throughout your entire life, because it's present in the box in the corner of your room. It is the television that gives you, tells you how to think, how to look at the world. And I find that without it, leftists would really be lost. They'd be forced to interact with a reality that isn't being tinted for them. constantly. And that would be a really interesting thing to see, is what happens when you take a leftist, take all of their technology away, and leave them without it for a week. I would voucher that many of them would actually start to reject their leftism. They'd be, the first few days would be this crisis, and then they'd eventually reject it because they'd be forced to enter a complex reality that most right-wingers live in. They'd be forced, for example, to accept that they're part of nature. And in a way, maybe, as Morgoth points out, this misanthropy comes in a way from them also thinking in terms of stories, in this way of fantasy. Maybe this is why their personal experience seems so important to them, because in the end, and this is why facts don't matter to them either, it's because it's all really just a story. It's all really a fantasy that they're making up as they're going. They're literally LARPing their lives. And I can't explain that any other way than that's just goddamn insane. They're completely insane. But obviously not all of them, and there's varying degrees to this, like the Antifa Chazes, let's call them, the Zetas of the Chad scale are quite literally LARPers. They LARP their life away, which is kind of pathetic when you think about it, but it's true. And recently one of them got shot for it. But still, that doesn't discourage them. In a way, that man dying affirms their weird fantasy. Every bit of resistance they get from people affirms their weird fantasy they have. And when we look back at Cracka, it seems to just be a normalization of this fantasy narrative they have, of this revenge narrative, and they're just blatantly, explicitly telling people what they want to do now. They're not saying, oh, imagine what if this was the case. They're saying, prepare for this, because we're going to do it to you. And I find that to be quite terrifying, but I think there's hope at the end of the tunnel. There always is. And just like with every story, I think I've only watched the movies. It's been a pet little goal of mine to read Tolkien's books. But we have to remember that there is always something that can turn the tide, and in general, it's the little acts of goodness that make the world shine a little brighter. And it's all our little acts of goodness towards one another, towards the nation, towards each other. It's as simple as flying a flag outside your window. It's as simple as having a little badge on your backpack or something. It's these little acts of resistance that eventually culminate into something greater. We take little steps and we'll eventually reach a mile. And that mile will slowly transform into 2 miles, and then 4, and then 6. And before we know it, not a year has passed, and we've circled the globe several times. And I think that with all of this happening now, there is hope that people might start acting more than just talking. There's hope that we might actually see something happen in the world. And we have to be hopeful at the end of the day. Because without it, what's the point of living? Sława. Z Bogiem.